Hello and welcome back to the Scale Modelling Cafe, and welcome to part 3, the construction of the Arma Hobby Ki-84. Before we start gluing bits together, I decided to rivet the entire airframe. I'm a big believer in riveting. I think it really adds something to the model. And pop over and have a look at my accuracy discussion for the reasons why. Anyway, here's my process. And it starts with highlighting all the surface detail with black oil paint. The reason for this is when you come in with rulers and tape and all this other kind of stuff to help you get a straight edge, it really does give you a guide, because you can see much more clearly where that detail is, so you know exactly when to stop the rivet wheel moving across the surface. So after leaving it for an hour or so to sort of dry, it's oil paint, so it takes days, but it gets polished off with just a bit of kitchen towel. And now for the riveting. So I'm using the Galaxy Models rivet wheel. This is the 0.4mm wheel, and you can see it's the small wheel. And I start by just going along all the existing panel lines, and you can see now that the advantage of having the panel lines in black means they're much easier to see. It's easier to line up the straight edge, and it's easier for a nice accurate pass. And it skews that sort of white blurry thing coming into shot. That's my magnifying headset thing, which I just recently turned 50, so I'm relying more and more on that. Okay, it's not all about straight edges. There is a bit of freehand work, and sometimes it's just easier if it's not too long, just the short bits, just to do it freehand. But you can see the care I'm taking just to make sure I don't get any wobbles in there. And now to fill in the gaps. So taking a very fine pen, I've measured and marked out exactly where I want the rivets to go. I did download a copy of some plans that I just quick Google search, and I just found them on the internet. And then it's just a question of using the marked lines as a guide, going in with a ruler and just filling in all the gaps. And again, this is where the panel lines, and having highlighted them in black, is really useful, because you don't want any stray lines going over any sort of distinct panels or anything like that, such as the gun access panels, which didn't have rivets. And then with a bit of thinner on a bit of kitchen towel, I just remove all the ink. I know some people have tried pre-shading with a Sharpie, and it was a bit of a disaster, because the ink leaches through all the layers of paint and varnish and looks horrendous. So it's just worthwhile just removing all that just in case. And you can see the difference between the riveted wing and the unriveted wing. It's massive. Slightly different technique on the fuselage. Because of the curvature, it's very difficult to get the metal ruler to kind of sit there. So just with a bit of Dymo tape, and I tend to stick it to masking tape, because it does, the glue on the Dymo tape itself does lose its stick extremely quickly. So I just use that on the curved edges as a bit of a guide. And again, taking lots of care. And whatever's comfortable. So there you go. I've just switched it round. It's now upside down, just because the wing root was getting in the way, and it just makes it easier to hold. So just whatever's comfortable and whatever easy, and just put a bit of music on, or a podcast or something, and lose yourself in the moment. If I'm honest, it is tedious. It's only a small model. It only took a few hours, but it's definitely definitely worth it, I think. And again, going in with the freehand where it's just easier. The important thing here is not to get carried away and not to start rushing, because as soon as you do that, you'll get a wonky line, and if you get a wonky line, you're gonna have to fill it, sand it, polish, and start all over again, and it is a real pain. So less haste, more speed, as we say in the UK. Now for the rear fuselage, and it would be very difficult to line everything up on both sides so it all matched, and to get it perfectly straight and vertical. So what I did is I just take the fuselage halves together, and then using some of the Tamiya flexi tape and a bit of Siemens eye, is I just marked out with tape this time exactly where I wanted the rivet lines to go. And then it was just a question of using the rivet wheel against the tape and taking my time and slowly working myself along. Here you can see I wasn't happy with the straight edge. It was a little bit wonky, and using this tape is brilliant because it's very flexible. So stretching it with a little bit of tension to help it get it straight. I'm just correcting it, and then we'll go back in with the rivet wheel. Now you can go over the seam line if you want. Now obviously those rivets are going to get obliterated when you come to clean up the seams, and sometimes I go over the seam and just restore them. As you can see there, I'll end up restoring those freehand. Sometimes I'll just leave them on the panels just either side of the seam line, and then I'll go and actually put them in for the first time after I've polished the seam. It just depends on the model, depends how I'm feeling. There is a risk by doing that though, that they don't quite line up, and it's going to be very prominent because seam lines do attract the eye on a model, because we're all very critical, and it's one of the things we check for when looking at models is how the modeler has done his seam lines. So it's worth going in and just taking the time. I don't normally do this, but for the purposes of showing it up on camera, I then covered the model in thin black oil paint, allowed that to dry again for a couple of hours, and polished it off with a kitchen towel. This is going to do a couple of things. One, it's going to highlight all the rivets so you can inspect your work, check them and correct any errors. And like I say, it shows up on camera, and you see what a lovely result that is. Just zoom in there. Absolutely love that. Brilliant. And the other one is, it just by polishing it, even with just a cloth like that or an old t-shirt, it will just knock some of the rough edges off and just reduce the height of the crater, if you like, from the rivet. Right, some detailing in the wheel well now. Normally I don't detail the wheel wells, but it was included in the Edward set, so I thought I may as well. And it really does lift some of the detail here. Just all the photo etch parts were just on one side at a time, were all cut out, trimmed off. All the burrs removed with a sanding stick, and then just using super glue they were just plopped into place. There's a few little boxes that need to be folded up and made up. That was all fairly straightforward. And what you could do is, I did find some pictures on the internet of the wheel well, and there was quite a lot of cabling going on down there, so you could add that as well if you want, but I'm not a real huge fan, if I'm honest, of detailing wheel wells, because normally the models sat on the shelf and you don't normally see them, they're not that prominent. But as I said, it was included in the Edward set, so I thought, you know, I may as well use it. But that's why I didn't go ahead and add all the wiring, because, you know, unless you're going to pick it up and turn it over, you're not really going to see it. Some of the ones at the front, obviously on a curve shape, so the edge parts were annealed just in a flame, and that makes it easier then to bend and conform to shape. But you can see how well the photo etch fits. Now this was a bit of a fiddle. As you can see, I'm struggling a bit. My super glue is getting a little bit old, so it's losing its initial grab, which is a bit of a pain. But these sort of thin curved bits just go on there, and just the sort of the horizontal bit just to the right of that, as you can see, the instructions did say to remove that and replace it with a bit of photo etch, but I don't have a chisel, and I thought it might leave a bit of a scar, so I just left that bit. Right, now we're going to add the one piece upper and lower wing. Really nice, elegant piece of design actually, this. And just going in with a bit of the ammo thick glue first. We're just going to apply that, and then we'll just bring the two parts together. Now, one thing to bear in mind is, at the trailing edge, it overlaps ever so slightly, and that's not a mistake by Arma, that's the real thing, because this aeroplane had butterfly flaps, which was, we call them in the fighter business maneuver flaps, and what it does is, during air combat, they ever so slightly deploy, a bit like slats on the leading edge, analogous to that, and creates more lift, so it reduces your turn circle and or your radius, and increases your turn rate, which is extremely valuable when doing dogfighting, as we used to call it. Obviously, they were also used for landing, but because they actually generated sort of a lot of lift and the drag, obviously, what they tended to do when they were coming into land was, in the flare, they would shut the flap, which would dump the lift and dump the aeroplane on the ground, otherwise it would float for a long time. They were very efficient. But the design means there's a little, like I say, they just kind of overlap on the trailing edge, so you will see a little lip at the back. Don't sand it away, don't fill it in, it should be there. The bottom flap just sticks out a little bit underneath the top of the trailing edge. So I'm just going in with a nail. There's a bit of oozing from the glue. I just want to remove that because I want a nice crisp join, visible join on that trailing edge. Just using the tweezers as well, a little bit more precise than the thumbnail. Yeah, bit sticky, that bit of ooze, but managed to get rid of it in the end. Don't squeeze too hard is the moral. Okay, this is a bit of 3M sanding sponge that I picked up from Telford one year from the Zokimura stand. They were selling it, and I thought, oh, that'd be quite good. And it's really good for polishing leading edges because it's not obviously backed by a hard backing, so you can bend it so it conforms to the curvature of the leading edge, and it's really good for just polishing that surface. Now, I did have a few little slight gaps and imperfections, and I'm putting that down to me rather than the kit, because the kit is superb. I'm convinced it was me. And we'll see how I fix that in just a second. And the way I fixed it was just with a bit of black super glue. This is the stuff from Ammo, and I tend to use the older stuff from this. Some of the stuff that it's losing its bit of stick, but rather than throwing it away, it's really good for filling and things like that. So it just gets thinly spread over where you need it, and just let it dry, hit it with an accelerator and polish it off. And once all that's done, we can go in and restore the panel lines around the leading edge, because obviously they're going to get obliterated by sanding. And this is one of my favourite tools in the toolbox. It's an RB Productions, can't remember what it's called. It's like a panel line restorer for seams, which is a bit wordy. I'm sure they had a natty name for it. And it's brilliant. It's like a little saw, but it's not actual protruding teeth as such. And they're very, very shallow. So you can't get too deep. Literally the depth of a panel line, it's all it will go down to, and it's absolutely brilliant. And then I'll just sand away any of the ridges it makes, and come in with a toothbrush to get rid of some of the dust, and then go in with a bit of extra thin cement, and just using a bit of capillary action, that'll smooth off any rough edges, get rid of any stubborn of the dust or anything like that, and if you're lucky, it looks like a one-piece moulded piece of plastic. Right, time to restore the rivets, and I made a little bit of a mistake here in that I did the rivets on the top and bottom surface, so in some areas they didn't quite line up. A bit of an error on my part. What I tend to do is I'll do the rivets when I'm doing the initial riveting, normally around the leading edge, just on one surface. So after I've polished away and cleaned up the seam, then I can just run that rivet tool in the previous rivets and then use that as a guide, and then finish off the entire panel, which I didn't do this time, and they didn't quite line up, so I ended up having a few double rows of rivets. So rather than just polish away all those rivets and start again, I just thought, yeah, life's too short to do any of that. So in some areas there are double rows of rivets, but I made sure it was symmetrical so it doesn't look too odd, and it almost looks pre-planned. That's my excuse, and I'm sticking to it. You've got to be careful doing the leading edge as well, is not to apply too much pressure, because if you do, and then when you turn it, the rivet wheel can run away, and you can get some errant lines. So yeah, you've got to be really careful when going around the very tight radius. Right, time to stick the fuselage seams together, and there are no pins and holes, they're kind of little tabs, and it works brilliantly. It's almost on a dry fit, you can barely see the seam. Now I've glued the top seam already and polished it, but it's such a tight fit that it was really hard to get the scalpel blade in there with the flexible black super glue to actually glue the seam. So absolute brilliant engineering from Arma. But there we go, we're done, and it all lines up really nicely. And just a little bit of pressure, just to make sure we've got glue all the way along, and it has oozed a little bit. And then it's a very quick job, because I just use a little bit of accelerator, and then we can go in and sand the seam immediately. And I've said this before, but just in case you missed those videos, the reason I glue my fuselage seams with super glue these days, and this black super glue, is one, for speed, because I don't want to leave this drying for 2 or 3 days, and 2, it removes any chance of any sinkage whatsoever in the join that is a risk with weld action glues. You might think it's dry, but it does take quite a while to go off. And I know some modelers, airline modelers, who actually leave a fuselage seam for a year just in case. So using finer grits, we'll just go in and polish away, remove any of the scratches, and then we can go in and restore the riveting. Now there's 2 panel lines that are very, very close to the center seam. Luckily, because the fit is so good, it was very minimal sanding and polishing, but I did have to go in and restore those lines of rivets very carefully. Don't want any wobbles in this along those seams, and that's a feature of the Japanese aeroplanes. They tended to put almost like a capping piece, very thin, down the centre of the fuselage. So you do tend to get two longitudinal panel lines very close to the centre seam. And then the horizontal one at the back was just put in as well. And just restoring some of the rivet lines that go over the centre seam that have been removed through sanding. And as you can see there, it's quite a quick job. Okay, gluing the fin, that was using the traditional extra thin cement, as you can see from Ammo. And I do like this brush, it is very precise, it gets right in there. And that was sanded the next day. The gluing surface is very small, there's going to be minimal shrinkage on that, which is why I used that particular glue. And then we can go in with that long brush and just reinforce the join from the inside with the liquid cement. So we've got the best of both worlds. We've got the strength of the super glue, and then we've got the lack of shearing, as it were, with the cement. Now gluing the top piece on, the turtle deck, I think you could call it. This one on really quite nicely. I think in hindsight, what I should have used is a bit of the super glue again and a bit of accelerator, because I ended up with a slight step on mine, and if I'd used the super glue, then I could have done it two ways. I could have just held it there until it went off, or I could have filled it and sanded it again to restore it. Gluing the wings onto the fuselage, really easy. The fit's lovely, just a little bit of pressure. So just here at the back end, there was a very slight gap there, which just filled with a little bit of Mr. Surfacer. And then using the peg at the front just to hold the front in place, we could do the wing roots. And again, the fit is absolutely brilliant. There's also a join just at the very front on the leading edge. Again, you can barely see it, but just a little touch of glue. And then that was left overnight to dry, just with the clamps there, the pegs, just to hold it down. Easy peasy. Okay, as I said, I wasn't that happy with the finish here, and in hindsight I wish I'd used the black super glue, but I just added a little bit of Mr. Surfacer with a cocktail stick, and that's just going to help blend in the panel lines to make them look like all the other panel lines. And then the tail planes, really nice fit, just the slightest little bit of glue there, holding it in with a bit of pressure. And then looking at it, making sure it's all square. And this is the advantage of using that liquid glue, you do have a bit of manipulation time. Right, the engine. This needs to be built and painted before we close up the cowling around it. Just using some Alclad. I think I used aluminium here. Sorry about the focus. My camera's a bit sensitive at times. But yeah, nice and shiny. And you can see the detail there. Absolutely brilliant. Takes a wash nicely. This is Tamiya Black weathering wash. And looking at pictures, there wasn't too much detail painting to do. It was all pretty much silver. So here's the two rows. We're just going to glue them together. It took a little bit of working out actually. Obviously there's only one combination how they go, but it's not that obvious. So yeah, once I worked it out though, which bit went where, it was a simple job to just glue them together. And then the push rods, again they were silver. Again that was another bit of a fiddle, but it fits nicely. Managed to get the ignition harness to work. That's actually been soaked in photo etch burnishing fluid to give it that colour. It's not paint. And then what I did is I actually glued this in place. Now the instructions say don't glue this. And in hindsight I wish I hadn't glued it, because that meant I could get the propeller to spin, but there we go. And then the crankcase just goes over the top, wedging it all in. And then we need to wire everything up once all that glue has dried, which is a bit of a fiddle actually. It's brass, obviously it's photo etched, the ignition harness, and it does spring out, but got there in the end, and that's a finished result. Really beautifully detailed, that. And then to mount it, so there's a couple of lugs on the inside and then a couple of cutouts on the sort of mounting ring on the rear bank of cylinders, and it just pops it into place. And then to put the cowling pieces on, so the underside and then the top piece and then the front all went on. It all fits really nicely, if I'm honest, but what happened with mine is I had a very slight step on the cowl ring, and I think that was me, because I think what must have happened is maybe an errant bit of wire from the ignition harness got in between the cylinder heads and the side, which just splayed out ever so slightly the side pieces. Fits really nice. Now what I had done on this top piece is it's solid. So what I ended up doing is drilling out the gun ports, and then I just added a bit of tubing, some Albion Alloys tubing on the inside, just to give the impression of the gun muzzles. And again, everything just fits really, really nicely. Okay, underneath the Edouard photo etch was a bit small actually, so I ended up using the photo etch that was included in the kit for the grill, which worked really nicely. And then this two-piece carb intake or oil cooler, it's probably the oil cooler actually, carb intake's on the top, isn't it? Again, that fits really nicely. Just plops into place. Right, as I said, I had a slight step on the cowl ring, so I got a bit brave and I sanded it down with this Flooring Models sanding stick, which is nice and rigid. Scratches were polished away, and then using an MDC beading tool, I went in and restored the cowl fasteners. I love this beading tool. You actually get like a domed rivet, a circle with a dome in the middle, which replicates the moulded in ones really quite nicely, as you can see there. Just fairing in the windscreen with a bit of putty. This is the deluxe putty, so it's water based, so just using a damp cotton swab, we can go in and just clean that seam up. And that is the end of the construction. So that's the end of part 3. What's coming up in part 4? So spray a gloss black base for the natural metal. We use an absolute ton of masking tape. We do some exhausts. And we do the weathering, finishing off here with the post shade. And the final reveal. So stay tuned for that one, and I'll see you then. Bye bye.